I made money playing Satisfactory, so that means by definition I am a professional Satisfactory player. Does that mean I'm good at the game? Who knows? I said last video I wish I could have gotten the golden nut, and so I decided to just do that. Also, the last video was surprisingly popular, despite the first 10 minutes being deep-fried footage of grass, so it's time to sell out, baby! The golden nut costs 1,000 tickets at the Awesome Shop, and to get tickets you've got to sink items at the Awesome Sink, which basically means throwing them in the garbage in exchange for points. The only problem is, each ticket gets harder and harder to get, and while you can sink 250 iron ingots to get a ticket at the start of the game, after getting 999 tickets to get the 1,000th one, it would take, 125 million iron ingots. Considering I've already spent about 300 tickets on all the decoratives, getting another 1,000 is going to be a lot of points indeed. However, the more processed the item is, the more points it gives. While the lowly iron ingot gives 2 points, the ballistics warp drive gives almost 3 million points. The lesson here, you want to sink as far to the end of the crafting chain as possible. Now there's 2 ways to go about this. I could sit here in my base sinking everything for who knows how long until I get enough tickets, or I could build an entirely new base and make a ton of one item with the sole intention of throwing it all into the sink. This video isn't an 80-hour time lapse, so you can probably guess which one I chose. I spent some time cleaning up all the things I left hanging, like researching everything in the MAM and setting up synthetic power shards so that I never need to sacrifice another slug again. Then I spent about an hour flying all over the map setting up radio towers so they can see all the resource patches, since that's going to heavily affect where I decide to build, like this sandy beach. I've also set up a portal that'll bring me to and from the main base while I build out here. They're great, but they take a constant supply of singularity cells to work. Speaking of, that's what I'm going to be building. I'm going for 100 singularity cells per minute. Maybe some Satisfactory expert will disagree, but looking at the ratio of cost, points, and effort to build, they seem like the best choice. Except, my entire power grid is being taken up by my first base, and so if I want to build anything else, I'll need more power. I really don't want to deal with nuclear power again, and so I've decided to just make a ton of fuel power. For that, I've settled on this beach that gives me 4 fully filled pipes of oil. And you want to know something? I'm using blueprints this time. I talked a lot of crap about them in the last video, and I still feel mostly the same, but they really shine when you know what you're doing and that you'll need a lot of it. I've got to the highest tier blueprinter, which is still only big enough to fit a few refineries, but it's better than nothing. I could just turn all this oil directly into fuel, but I've got an alternate recipe to turn it all into heavy oil residue. I have since learned that if you set up your blueprints properly, you can make it so that they'll automatically connect on the ends, which is nice. It still takes some finagling when it decides to do stuff like this and attach to some random junction next to it, but it's a million times better than doing it bit by bit. I've decided to do all of this over this ocean because it's easy to just make a flat plane of concrete over everything. I've also decided I'm going to be putting in effort decorating everything. I've thought up this design that it can hopefully paste as many times as it takes to cover the whole thing. I've also added lights, because I hate not being able to see things at night, and putting things inside walls also makes it harder to see them during the day. That's also why I'm making the roof mostly glass. There, now no one can say I'm playing the game incorrectly. There's like 2,400 heavy oil a minute across 4 pipes. I can turn that heavy oil into fuel using the diluted fuel recipe in these blenders, and so I've got to make another blueprint for it. Since it's got 3 different fluids, I decide to color code the pipes, but it's a bit of a pain, and for some reason when I'm pasting it from the blueprint, it likes to paint the pipe but leave the volume indicators the default green. It goes away if I reload, so whatever. With how long all this is going to take, that leaves me plenty of time to talk about the last video. I think most people got it, and it was amusing seeing some of the Satisfactory tourists being like, "Why is he complaining so much?" when it's the same tone I use in any of my Factorio runs. But it probably feels more appropriate when it's some CBT Factorio challenge run instead of just playing a different game normally. Also, a lot of people mistook me saying I'm used to it being like this in Factorio whenever I encountered something new as I think it should be this way in Satisfactory. Listen, I like Satisfactory, but just not as much as Factorio, alright? Anyway, there's like way too much fuel. The hardest part of making these things look good is definitely the roof. It's hard to make something more interesting than just a flat surface, but I've tried my best. So I could just use all this to make power right off the get-go, since this is already like 4 million megajoules per second, but I don't want to process it more. First, though, I've got to get rid of all the residuals from the heavy oil. I could just throw it in a sink, but instead I'm going to turn it into plastic, since the singularity cells will take some. Since this recipe takes in a solid with some water and spits out another solid, I've got to make another blueprint. I really wish I could mirror these blueprints, but I guess I can't complain too much because it's only been like a year since we could mirror chemical plants in Factorio. This is a bit of a lower effort video, so I'm going over this stuff really fast. And even in a genre where an hour of gameplay can sometimes turn into only a minute of video, the fact that it's only been this long and I've already blown through 13 hours of footage is impressive. When you're playing to decorate as well as build big, the playtime really adds up. I can help it a lot with blueprints, but at the end of the day, there is no getting around all these little fiddly details. Regardless, I've saved myself from sinking the residue, so now I can sink the plastic. For now. Don't ask why I made 3 right turns of pipes instead of 1 left turn, I just wanted more pipes. The next step is turbo fuel, and that takes sulfur and coal to make the compressed coal it requires. Thanks to my radio towers, I know that there's a few spots reasonably close by, and while I was tempted to make rails, there is no beating the convenience of a giant floating platform. I felt a little bad about just having them defying the laws of physics, so I put a bunch of fans on them. It makes perfect sense, don't question it. There's also some nitrogen gas I've got to get, but now I can bring all this stuff back to the beach. Hooray. I'm not going to be looking at this stuff like ever, so I don't care as much that it looks like crap. To actually make the compacted coal, I've got to put it in a bunch of assemblers, and since I've got 1,200 of both, I need a whopping 48 assemblers to make the full use of them. 48 is divisible by 8, which is conveniently about the limit of assemblers I can fit into the blueprinter. Now that I've got to that, I've just got to paste it 6 times. And why not just build a big high-rise for all this stuff? One thing I'm realizing is just how much steel decorating stuff like this costs. Even though I already have all but one of the dimensional depot upgrades, I had to make a second steel depot just to upload it faster. At least if I run out, all I gotta do is wait for it to come back. Apparently these floor holes are used for making these really tall conveyor lifts, which is really good because this thing's really tall. Using that, I can feed all of these floors with the same Mark 6 belt and some splitters to get 2 Mark 6 belts of compacted coal out. The compound is really shaping up. I hook this stuff up to some sinks to make sure it's working properly. That's a little weird, but if you want to see if your build is actually outputting the rate that you're looking for, you've got to wait for every building to backlog. Except that didn't even catch that one of the input belts was a Mark 2 instead of a Mark 3, so never mind, but that's why you verify. So this is when I realized I'd massively overbuilt, and to use up all this fuel I've made, I'd need like twice as much compressed coal, but it's better to have too much than too little, and just this is gonna take like 80 refineries anyway. Seriously, I've got to build so many of these, I ran out of materials in the depots while building this like twice. At least I ended up with a nice clean 8 rows, so I can plug each one of these pipes into its own row. Setting up all these things takes forever, and it's kind of fundamentally unblueprintable, so this is the kind of stuff that you simply can't avoid if you're trying to build at this kind of scale in Satisfactory, but I needed to wait around for my dimensional depots to refill anyway. I also added these, like, stadium lights. I thought that, you know, now that I'm putting everything in these big warehouses, having a bunch of stuff just sitting out in the open suddenly becomes interesting now that it's the exception rather than the rule. Also, I was just dreading putting a roof over this monstrosity, so I just didn't. This is also when I'm figuring out that the lights just cut out if you're far enough away, so a build this big will just be half dark no matter what. I mean, I understand why from a performance perspective, but it just makes me a little sad. There's turbo fuel, but I want to turn it into rocket fuel next, and that takes some nitric acid. That's what I got that nitrogen gas for, as well as some iron, since it takes iron plates to actually make the acid. I actually needed to run another pipe for the nitrogen gas. Compared to everything else, I only need 4 of these, but that's already an absurd amount of acid blenders. Conveniently, I can fit 2 smelters and 2 constructors in the same footprint. That's everything I need for the final step, turning this all into rocket fuel. I really do think you need to start building at this kind of scale before the true industrial aesthetics of this game kicks in, and that's exactly what I'm doing this for. Stacking all the pipes like this is really satisfying for some reason. So now I've just got to make a ton of this blueprint. The rocket fuel recipe also spits back out some compacted coal, so I've got to fit in 2 fluid inputs, a fluid output, and a belt output. Just like Factorio, once you've got versatile blueprints like this, the main time sink becomes routing all the items into it. I've got to deal with getting 2 different fluids in, while also taking the compacted coal byproduct out and routing it back into the turbo fuel refineries, giving me a total of 1,500 compacted coal a minute. I stop in the middle of decorating it to make sure that it's actually working properly. Those little bumps in the belts make me laugh a little bit. I decided to paint this whole thing red for some reason, but there's way too much rocket fuel. I technically could turn this into ionized fuel to fully process it if I wanted to unlock the ultimate fuel, but that's just way too much effort for not much gain. Now I've just got to make 100 fuel generators filled with power shards to consume it all. This is when I'm really thankful that I put in the effort to automate power shards. I've been eschewing sharding up these builds because them being massive feels like it's kind of the point, but I make an exception for these things because I had to drain all of my reserves of engines and encased beams just to finish this much. Also, these things are so huge you can only fit 2 in the blueprinter, and that means a lot of pasting and stopping to delete the one pipe that really wants to latch onto nearby junctions. Hey, it's my fault for wanting to mirror them like this. Hook up the rocket fuel, and that's 60,000 megawatts of fuel power. Building all of this took me over 10 hours, but I think I've gained a lot of experience. I'm still mostly playing blind, but I have seen a few Satisfactory builds since then. One thing I've learned is that you really want to have a standardized size for things, because a lot of these buildings are just pasted the blueprint until I had enough, but then ended up with it being something like 9 foundations wide when my blueprint for decorative walls is 5 foundations wide. The result is a lot of surgery to make it fit. While I'm more into the challenges of my automation games, it's not like I don't have a sense of aesthetics, and I can see the appeal of Satisfactory. Factorio was originally inspired by the Minecraft Create mods, and playing Satisfactory like this is kinda going back to that mindset. I remember playing Minecraft a million years ago, and I inevitably wanted to make a large base with lots of rooms, but then you fill them up and you're like, crafting table, storeroom, and then you're out of practical applications and then it's all imaginary. I feel like Satisfactory fills a bit of that niche where you're allowed to decorate and make these big compounds that also serve a utilitarian purpose. Of course, Minecraft mods also do that these days, but anyways, I've got power. That just leaves, building everything else. Yeah, all that effort and I've basically made 0 progress. At least I don't need to worry about power anymore. I thought long and hard on where to build, and after counting all the things I'll need and mapping out all the resource patches, I've decided upon building in the northwestern desert. It's not perfect, but it's got most of the stuff I'll need nearby. I've learned my lesson about running belts along the ground, and now I'm making a nice row of foundation to put all the belts across. For my purposes, I'll need about 3 belts of iron ore over here, as well as some coal. A fully overclocked mining drill on a pure node is enough to completely fill the highest tier of belt, and the fact that I've got 3 pure iron ore nodes as well as some coal is exactly why I chose this place. The blueprinter is nice, but needing to repeatedly lay down these rows of belts to get from point A to point B makes me really wish I could just Control-C and Control-V it like in Factorio, but I'll try to keep those instincts in check in case people start saying I'm complaining too much again. Anyway, I've got all this down here, and I've also chosen the desert because it's mostly flat. There's not much here right now, but hopefully soon it'll be filled with singularity cells. It's always a little bit intimidating placing down the first building, but it's all got to start somewhere. I need something like 1,400 iron plates per minute, and it's funny because only 400 of those are necessary to make everything else, while the other 1,000 are going entirely into the one final step that I won't be able to make until literal days later, but it's the best place to start. I've gone for this setup that has the smelter in line with the constructor since the ratios are 1-to-1 for making plates. I also need like 70 of these, so I've got to make 3 floors like this. I do appreciate the underclocking mechanics, since even though I only need 69.5 of these, I can set everything to 96.67% speed to make it an even 24 per floor while still having the perfect ratio. This is a very satisfying build. You can see some of the weirdness with Satisfactory's manifold designs, where the bottom is getting 50% of the resources, while the next 2 floors are only getting 25%, but it'll balance out pretty soon. That leaves making some steel, but compared to the amount of iron plates I had to make, it's almost pathetic. I only need like 12 of these, and that'll be enough steel for the entire build. It's kind of funny because when I'm aiming to build a massive compound like this, something being this small actually makes it harder to fit in aesthetically. But regardless, that's all the steel I've got to make. I'll be using this mainly for screws and pipes, but this will become the basis for the cubes I need for the singularity cells. Alright, that was exciting, but now it's back to the resource grind. The next resource I need is tons and tons of concrete. I need 2,000 per minute just for the singularity cells themselves, but another 300 or so for the other ingredients. That is an ungodly amount of limestone, and so that's why I've chosen the alternate recipe, fine concrete. It goes from taking 3 limestone for every 1 concrete to only 1.2 with the small addition of a little silica, but that's still going to take nearly 3,000 limestone per minute to make it all, and the 3 pure limestone nodes and quartz nodes nearby are why I chose this place. Except I can't seem to find the quartz node anywhere. I know it's there thanks to the radio tower, but it is mysteriously absent. Well, I've played enough of this game to know that it's probably in some cave somewhere, and how right I am. It's not only a cave, but it's also the biggest cave I've ever seen, whose only entrance is like 10 kilometers away from my base. Seriously, I do not want to need to run a belt all the way in and all the way out, and so I've decided to use those conveyor holes again. I place one down as low as I can, start building a conveyor lift, and then run all the way into the cave. Thankfully, it's long enough to just go through the floor and make it into the ceiling. Tell me I'm not a genius. Well, with that, I can get all this raw quartz out of the cave and onto the surface and put it alongside the limestone. I'm building up here because I'm too cool to just make a single flat plane of concrete. I've seen some major Satisfactory bases, and a lot of them are these giant edifices that fit everything inside one building, but I'm partial to this compound approach. I've got to turn the quartz into silica before I can make concrete, and to do that I've remade the constructor stack I used in my original base, but even better this time. I can easily paste these side by side until I've got enough. It looks really impressive, except the eagle-eyed viewer might realize that I accidentally set it to crushed quartz instead of silica, so I've got to clear everything out. Still, looks cool. Next comes the concrete. It takes assemblers, and a whole lot of them. Fortunately, I can just reuse the assembler stack I made for the compacted coal back at the power plant. I've just got to paste this a bunch of times and set everything to fine concrete. I'll need 64 of these. Instead of making a tower that's 8 stories tall, I've settled for 2 towers that are only 4 stories tall. The best thing about this is I can reuse the wall designs as well, and since the original build is on the other side of the map, I don't need to feel bad about having duplicates either. I've got to sync it to make sure it's getting the right throughput, but there's our concrete high-rise up and running. So many beautiful angles to look at this thing from. Apparently the inline splitters and mergers on lifts were a fairly recent addition, but I cannot imagine life without them. And now it's time to tackle the biggest resource demand. Singularity cells take copper powder, and copper powder takes an ungodly amount of copper ingots to make. To support 100 singularity cells per minute, I need over 12,000 copper ingots a minute to make the nuclear pasta. That is, frankly, ridiculous, and while I've been saving them, this is a perfect time to use some summer sloops. Only 10 sloops and some overclocked constructors will drop that demand down to only 6,000 ingots per minute. That's still an ungodly amount, but at least it's manageable. That's the story behind this blueprint, because I'm going to need to be running a lot of belts. The pure copper mines are a little far, and for a moment I considered finally using trains, but I'm basically going to need 100% of these mines' output. And having a train means I've got to worry about buffers and schedules and throughput compared to belts that'll just output 1.2k forever and ever, amen. Also, it's extra time, but I'm making sure to add a support beam every blueprint length, because I can see this from my base. This is the last GIF of this area I've chosen. Copper nodes are far less frequent compared to iron, but there's still a few pure ones over here. Even so, I need 5 pure nodes just to feed the nuclear pasta. Fortunately, there's an alternate recipe for copper ingots that lets me use half iron ore and half copper ore to make 2 copper ingots. It's pretty much a no-brainer. I'll spare you hooking up the rest of this and skip right to when I've got 3 belts of copper and 3 belts of iron ore. Now I've just got to turn that into ingots. Because I'm using 2 inputs, I've got to use foundries instead of smelters. The easiest thing to do is make 3 separate rows that can consume a full belt of iron and copper each. This is going to make the steel build look like a total joke. I'm even able to reuse the wall designs from the iron build and give them all this nice custom roof. Set up some sinks to make sure it's all working, and look at that, that ore is just zooming. That is 7,200 copper ingots per minute. Building like this, it's a lot like how I tackle Factorio overhauls, just doing one thing at a time and slowly building up. I'll need to take back my comment to the last video about never needing more than 1 belt of anything. I really like how this one came out though. We've still got a lot to go, but this place is slowly filling out. I feel like white would have fit the desert surroundings better, but I refuse to change it from purple into green. This covers the bulk of the raw resources, at least until the pressure conversion cubes, so now I've got to do some manufacturing. There are 3 things I need for the heavy modular frames, and I can make all of them over here by the stacks for the silica. Since they take constructors, I am once again using my constructor stack, and since they all take steel, I've just got to run it through. The first thing I need is steel pipes for the frames, and after that I just need some rods, which I can make from steel using the steel rods alternate recipe. And then I can turn most of those into screws. When I say this goes up fast, I really mean it. Just like the silica, I'm not putting these inside, but I can at least put up these big lights on them so they're not totally in the dark. I think these are definitely my favorite to look at. I'm not sure you can tell from literally everything I've ever made, but as far as I'm concerned, the denser the machinery, the better. So since I'm just building whatever, wherever, I've got to get off this cliff and back down to the main level of the desert. I've got this tweaked assembler blueprint that routes the product down the center instead, and this will make the reinforced plates. I was kind of worried that this wouldn't look good so deep in this pit compared to the other buildings around it, but then I had the genius idea of just putting the modular frames up top of it. They both need a similar amount of assemblers, so I can just square them up with underclocking. It's a bit of a stereotype that technically minded people aren't creative, because just like I enjoy learning and experimenting with the mechanics of automation, I also like adding little aesthetic tricks into my arsenal. I like how mixing in these glass foundations under where the belts need to go looks on the second floor, like the floors where the machines need to go needs the structure. It's a nice little touch. I mean, the main problem with putting things in buildings is it's harder for me to look at them, so the more glass the better. I'm also able to reuse the walls I originally designed for the refineries, and it makes me appreciate just how tall those things are, because this one blueprint more than covers 2 floors of assemblers. All the stuff I made just goes in, and that's the modular frames. It might feel like we're getting somewhere, but there is still so much to do. Regardless, compared to my first video, it's much better now that I actually make sure to get some good glamour shots of all these individual builds as I finish them. Beautiful. Okay, so the only thing I've got left before I can start throwing things together is encased steel beams. I need just over 8 assemblers to take care of my demand, and while I could use one of my existing blueprints, it wouldn't really look good in this space I've got to fill out, and so I'm making something custom. That takes a lot more work though, and because of how blueprinting works in this game, it means you're building something with the confidence that you'll never need to use a similar design again. I don't know, maybe it's genius. Maybe the judgment call to make the optimal use of your time is part of the challenge. I got some comments on the last video like, Satisfactory's perfect, you're just biased. And it's like, yeah, fair enough. I mean, I'm gonna automatically assume Factorial's way of doing things is easier because I've got 5,000 hours of familiarity with it, but it goes both ways. And anyone who says the building in Satisfactory is better is simply deluding themselves. Satisfactory makes up for it with all the dynamics of decoration and design you can do, but my instincts are yelling at me that I should be able to build all this stuff much faster. Yeah, so I kind of forgot to get any decent footage of this one. I was just so excited to move on to the next step. I've got to make the heavy modular frames, and I'm using a recipe that takes frames, beams, pipes, and concrete. These manufacturers are huge and kind of difficult to work with in the blueprinter, but still, I should have made a blueprint instead of hitting H, then page up 4 times, then 6, and then 8. This gets all the splitters at the appropriate heights to be able to fit in the conveyor lifts. Then I get to run all the belts. It actually annoys me how floaty everything looks, and so I add in some belt supports for no reason save my own sanity. Routing everything is a little easier said than done, since there's just so much stuff I've got to run through here. I've got to get the iron plates through as well, because I'm planning for all this stuff to eventually lead to the singularity cells building, so it makes sense to have all of it over here. The result is this extremely dense tangle of belts, which I love. With this much crap next to it, I've decided to go for a sort of pavilion design, relying on some pillars to hold up the roof. The important thing for me is to avoid making any of the buildings look too similar, and I think this is the perfect thing for a relatively small but complicated build. The pillars are a little offset to avoid colliding with the belts below, but whatever. I've also started dabbling in the metal roofing, but there's heavy frames. Building by building, it grows. Alright, this is as much as I can make on the cube path. To get any further, I need to make aluminum. There's basically only one biome that actually has bauxite, so I've got to make it there. That means leaving the precious embrace of my base and venturing into the Great Red Forest. I've got my eyes on one pure deposit over here. I'm just running some more foundations in the sky to run the belts, but I've also got to get some coal and some quartz to make the aluminum. The coal is on the way to the place I've spied out, and the quartz doesn't seem that far, but just like the first time, it doesn't seem to be where it should be. Once again, it's in another random cave. The floor is too thick to use the conveyor belt trick, so it looks like I'm doing this the hard way. Okay, there's the 3 things I need, all brought over to this place. I don't know what this biome is called. I'm sure some Satisfactorian knows, but to me it's the place with some lakes, and that's important because I need water to make the aluminum. I'll be honest, I already had to run this many belts just to get all this stuff here, and I was really considering just running all this stuff to my base and making it there, but no, I am determined to actually use trains properly this time. I'm using the normal aluminum path, which means that making this stuff spits out silica and takes in water. I only need 10 refineries to consume a whole belt of bauxite, but I actually underclock these so that each one takes in 100 per minute and build 12. That might seem incomprehensible, but there's actually a very good reason for that. The next step in the process spits out water as a byproduct, and I've got to get rid of that. Now, last time I solved that with some sort of gravity priority system, but this time, since I know for a fact that I'll be consuming 100% of these when the base is up and running, the water byproduct is exactly 600 square meters of water per minute. Not only that, but it's also the limit of the highest tier of pipe. It also means that with these underclocked refineries taking 150 water each, 4 refineries will be enough to completely and perfectly consume it. I've also underclocked the scrap so that 2 refineries will consume a full pipe of the solution. Routing all these pipes is another thing that's pretty much unblueprintable, but at least I've gotten much better at it. Also, this makes so much scrap that I need multiple tier 6 belts to carry it all, but now the last subcomponent is more silica. Just like the last silica build, I can reuse my ever-trusty constructor stack blueprint. It goes up no problem, and now I've just got to make all the foundries. Because the volume of the inputs is so high and I don't want to make this base even wider, I custom build a set of foundries that can run 2 belts of both the silica and the scrap down the center. The silica is a little bit annoying because I've got to priority merge the output from the first refineries and then split that across 2 lanes. Except both lanes need more than 600, so I can't just split a Mark 6 belt in half. It's a bit of a mess. This whole build is kinda mashed together, so I decided to give it the pavilion treatment as well. I'm not trying super hard to make it look good because it's just a small build separate from my main base, but I'm still putting in the effort. With all that set up, the last thing I need is the water. 2 overclocked pumps will do it, and I keep forgetting that there's a way to snap to the global grid and make them not all uneven, but whatever, no one's going to be looking down there anyway. I thought I was ready to turn it on, but then I realized that I built the constructor stacks the wrong way around and I had the quartz going in on the wrong belt. Well, I think it's an easy fix, but as I'm rebuilding it, the stack decides to auto-connect to the belts and start vomiting raw quartz onto the belts for my aluminum foundries. This is absolutely horrible because it's not like I can just sink all of them because they all got split into the foundries. I try to remove them one by one and really shove my face up in there for every single foundry, grabbing them until there's no more. With the constructors fixed, I can turn it back on. It runs for a bit, and suspiciously the left row of the foundries isn't working at all. It doesn't matter that I can't see anything in there, and I can't grab anything. Even if I change the recipe, these things are apparently just locked forever, so the only thing I can do is delete every single belt and then redo the entire thing. Like, I don't hate Satisfactory, but when someone asks why I prefer Factorio, I will point to things like this. But after that's done, I have finally got this whole thing online. This is where I need to come clean. This thing makes 1,200 aluminum ingots per minute, but to make 100 singularity cells, I actually need 1,230 ingots. I am not running a whole other belt of bauxite, just make 30 ingots, and so I will fix this with a single summer sloop in one of the constructors later. This game's kind of forgiving like that. Now I've got to make good on my promise to actually use trains. I need 1.2k of this stuff a minute, and so it's kind of important that my train can handle that throughput. I've decided that 3 cargo wagons should be enough, based on absolutely no information except blind faith. I'm also filling both the top and the bottom inputs of the cargo loading bays, because even though this thing makes 1.2k per minute, being able to load it something like 3k per minute will make up for any time that the train isn't here. Anything train-related feels absolutely massive, but they are trains, I guess. I made some rail blueprints while no one was looking, and that seems to be the only way to build an expansive rail network without wanting to tear your hair out. With all the ups and downs you got to do to get over the terrain, including the foundations and the blueprint is a must. My base is northwest of here, but I'm going due west. It'll mean a bit of a longer trip, but it'll be worth it for the convenience. This area is up a massive cliff compared to the desert, and getting down it is going to take a lot of rails. I have a ramp blueprint, but since the rails need to curve gently, I can't just place it like this. I've got to delete the rails, then reattach them to make the proper transition. I'm sticking to 1 meter ramps because I just like that you can still slide jump up them, but it's a long way down. And then my blueprint runs out of supplies. I make the arduous trek all the way to the teleporter in the compound, then all the way to the concrete boxes in my original base, only to realize that I've pretty much exhausted the supply of concrete I've been building up for literal days. It feels terrible, but I've got to switch to the budget version that's just the rails. Turns out, without the concrete to guide it, it is pretty much impossible to get the tracks to line up, so I've got to make at least a little bit to give me something to latch onto. I've also got to do a ton of manual adjusting, and when I get close to the ground, I realize that I'm going to overshoot my target, and so I've got to switch to 2 meter ramps instead. So much for my best laid plans. Now that I'm down here in this mostly flat area, I try to paste this T-junction I made, but it doesn't work. It just straight up refuses to attach at all. This is already as big as I can possibly make it in the blueprinter, so I suppose you're just not allowed to have junctions in this game, but there I go complaining again. At least derailing these trains cheers me up. Dealing with stuff like this is another reason I was hesitant to use trains, but now we're down here. The reason I wanted to run all the rails this way is because this is the way to my power plant. Don't forget, I mentioned that I need to get plastic, and so here I am. I make the same 1 to 3 train station as before, and then place this blueprint that glitched outside the blueprinter, but let me save it anyway. This is what I need for the track to be one-directional, and then I make another little siding to pick up nitrogen gas. You need a little bit of this stuff to make the pressure cubes, and as luck would have it, I've got loads of nitrogen gas on site already, so it's no problem. I have no idea how signals work in Satisfactory, so I'm just going to place them exactly like I would in Factorio and assume it works. It is really annoying to get them on the proper side of the rails sometimes. So, remember when I said I overbuilt this? Well, I would have been making enough plastic if I was actually consuming all the fuel, but I'm not, and so this build doesn't make enough. However, if I'm not using all the fuel, that means some of the crude oil is up for grabs. Somewhere, a Satisfactory player is crying, but I'd like to see you think of a better way to balance 4 pipes like this. There's some alternate recipes down the line that could have removed most of my plastic demand, but for me, it's much easier to just skim off some oil and make it the old-fashioned way. I already have a blueprint for a refinery that takes in a fluid and outputs a solid and a liquid, so this whole thing goes up relatively quickly. It spits out some heavy oil residue, and it's kind of funny that I make metric tons of that stuff intentionally, and while I could route this stuff into the fuel line, I really don't care. And so I'm just turning it into something solid and throwing it into the sink. The plastic from this meets up with the rest and uses a priority splitter, but there it is. Let's take one last look at the power area. Alright, that's plastic, nitrogen, and aluminum. That is almost all the raw resources I'll need. I've just got to get this back to the base, and... Okay, who left all these trains around here? Yeah, so I've got to make this T-junction again. Well, it's not like I'm going to be building more than one of these anyway. The signals are weird, but this arrangement works in Factorio, so I'm using it here. And now I've got to bring it the rest of the way to my base. There's just enough room to fit the stations, and it's like I know what I'm doing or something. I'm not going to bore you with putting all of this stuff up, but I will say that another weird thing about Rails is how sometimes you got to delete sections and make them in smaller chunks so that you've got something to split off to when you're trying to make these stations. Alright, set the stations, and... what in God's green earth? Are they supposed to do that? Okay, as it turns out, I'm really stupid, and I built all the stations backwards. Listen, it's hard being a Factorio player. We need our little arrows constantly showing us the right direction, okay? Genuinely, it's probably because in Factorio the signals can only be on one side of the rails per direction, but in Satisfactory they can be on either side and still let trains go in the same direction. Threw me off, okay? That's my excuse. I'm not stupid, I swear. Anyway, that's rectified by just swapping a train station with an unloading bay, but it's about time for that beautiful train ride. Did you know that whenever I stop talking, there's a marked decline in viewer retention across my videos? It's true. I suppose I have some kind of hypnotic quality, because even a 30-second montage of looking at a train loses some people. That's really interesting, right? I just thought I'd share that information for absolutely no reason as we watch this beautiful train network do its job. There are definitely some parts that could be improved, like the half-built giant floating ramp, but it seems to be working just fine. When I posted this base on Twitter, someone made fun of me for my Factorio-ass train system, and yeah, I mean, it works, doesn't it? I feel like you can really do an interesting base if you had these going in and out of a giant facility, but for me, just these stops is enough. See, I used trains properly this time. I'm just going to assume that all these unloading bays will be enough of a buffer to keep a constant output of 1.2k until the train can come back around. In Factorio, we're a little obsessed with balancing our train stations, but I'm sure it won't be a problem that all of these won't drain equally. I was thinking I could add extra trains if it gets too bad, but I forget that Satisfactory probably doesn't have train station limits, and I didn't design this area with any waiting bays, so adding more trains would probably just make them deadlock, so hopefully it's fine. Also, I'm realizing I really wish I'd remember to actually use the global grid for all these builds, because running all the tracks all the way back here, now I have two sets of foundation that are at slightly different positions, and so I've got to just pretend that it doesn't look wrong. Well, the only thing left to do with these aluminum ingots is turn them into aluminum casing. That's what this entire belt will be turned into, and so it's the return of the constructor tower. Like I said, one of these will have a single summer sloop inside to make the extra few casings I need. I'm putting it in one of the inner constructors because I don't want to be able to see the different animations, so I can pretend that this whole thing is perfect. Upgrading all these belts one by one makes me yearn for the upgrade planner, but this is my burden to bear since I don't want to make everything out of the same Mark 6 belts. Compared to Factorio, where we'll just use the best belts on a build that makes one item a second, here I think it looks way better if the belt speed matches the items as much as possible. This is all for the fused modular frames. The cubes are the most complicated part of this entire build, and this takes most of those casings as well as the heavy modular frames. I need about 8 of these, and blenders are big, so I'm doing another one of these 2-tiered designs. Can you believe that singularity cells is what I considered the easiest option? I can only imagine if I was trying to make ballistics warp drives. Also, don't you love when you're building something but it's just one nudge over so you've got to redo the entire thing? This build also doesn't get any walls because there's way too many things tangled around it. Getting all this stuff in is a bit of a mess, but it's the good kind of mess. This is the only use of the nitrogen gas over here, and so for convenience, I'm just running the pipe underneath all the foundations. It makes sense for a pipe, and a giant green tube going over the top of all my stations would just look weird. And there you have it, an absolutely wonderful addition to the compound. Having trains zipping in and out really does liven up the place. So there's 2 more steps on the cube's journey, and it starts with routing this plastic over everything. I considered building the stuff that takes the plastic somewhere else, but taking in just how much there is left to do, I would definitely run out of space if I built it over there, so here we go. There's a few other things I'll need, and one of them being quartz. I've already got some making silica, so I just need to siphon off the excess into this belt and bring it over. There's also strange alien matter in that big cave where I got the quartz, so I bring that up as well. I move them all side by side up to this flat area next to the copper ingots. I suddenly remember that I'll need some reinforced plates as well, so I've got to route those next to the plastic. It's getting a little spaghetti in here, but that's the way we like it. So all of this is for the next major item, and that's radio control units. That takes 10 manufacturers of oscillators. I'm setting these up first because they consume both the reinforced plates as well as the quartz right off the bat, so I won't need to worry about those anymore. It's crushed quartz again, and just like all the other times, I'm using my constructor stack. Once again, I'm out here building this thing by hand because I've got an obsession with mirrored designs like this, and it's too big to fit inside the blueprinter, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't take that long to set up. That takes care of the plates and the quartz, and that leaves the cables. This is why I went through all the effort to bring it back here. While I may need 6,000 copper ingots for the pasta, I've got 7,200 total, and the rest of that is all going into cables and sheets. This will all be taken care of by even more constructor towers. The blueprint that keeps on giving. I won't say this about the rest of my base, but this might just be the most optimal blueprint. Anyway, I've just got to feed this with the copper ingots, then that'll give me wires and sheets. The wires will then go into another set of constructors to make the cables. Just look at that. Once again, it's all illuminated with a tower. This planet doesn't seem to rain, so I'm sure it's fine to leave all this machinery out in the open. So that finishes off the oscillators, but next I've got to set up the computers. They also take about 8 manufacturers, and so I'll just be building them right on top of the oscillators. But before I can build that, I've got to make the circuit boards. That takes the plastic, as well as the copper sheets I just made, inside of an assembler. I'll need about 12 in total, and just like the other stuff, it's not really that difficult to set up, and mostly just a little time-consuming. Setting up the inputs and the outputs is a little awkward because of the footprint I'm trying to shove it into, because the plastic also needs to go into the computers, but in the end it's nice and dense, just the way I like it. The computers get set up exactly like the crystal oscillators, and so after all the splitters and lifts are set up, all that's left to do is route everything in. The cables split off from below, and the plastic and circuit boards are lifted from the build next door. Honestly, the real challenge of this build is decorating it. I'm still trying to give all the buildings their own unique identity, and so I've decided that this one will be a big building with a little hut on the side. But the consequences of that is that sometimes you got to cheat to pretend that things aren't clipping. I chose this design, and I really like the way that the roof overhangs this part. It's super cramped in here, but it looks good. Part of me wonders if I should have taken walkability into account for my designs, adding stuff like catwalks and maintenance pathways. But what can I say? It's difficult for me to consider the needs of the plebs without hover packs. I had to make all of this bespoke, but I think this has become my favorite building I've made yet. I love the circuit board annex and its sloped roof next to the sort of barn roof style of the main building. Even in stuff like this, you can track my growing competence. There are just so many good angles to look at this thing from. Alright, I've got my oscillators and my computers, now it's time to turn those into radio control units. Would you believe it? They're also made in another 8 manufacturers. You only need a manufacturer if it takes more than 2 ingredients, but the third one is just the rest of the aluminum casings, which are conveniently located next door, so that's no problem. Once again, it goes up remarkably quickly, and that leaves the decoration. The other one was bespoke, but this time I'm using the most basic glass wall blueprint I've got. I think next to the more complex design of the first building, this smaller one would look better with a simpler design. I've really fallen in love with the metal roofing, and I considered leaving the peak open for ventilation or something, but I decided I kinda like how it looks when you clip the steel frame in with a glass foundation. Turn all that on, and we've got another fine addition to our compound. All of this stuff is still subject to the whole needs to run for a few hours before everything's buffered up, but that's not a problem when it takes a whole hour to build each new section. Okay, I've really got to point out this audio bug that happens whenever you go into decoupled camera mode. You just get this constant whirring that refuses to go away until you spam the decoupled camera over and over again. Well, anyway, it's time for the penultimate cube. By combining the fused modular cube with some radio control units, you get pressure conversion cubes. I debated where to actually put this build, but it squeezes in just barely around here. I've realized that incorporating half foundations into your build makes it much harder to build good-looking walls, but I suffer it for the compactness. There's no such thing as a half wall or a half roof, so you've got to accept some amount of clipping if you want to add them. The thing is, I do have blueprints for a lot of this stuff, but once again, in the pursuit of aesthetics, I'm generally being forced to make everything custom. Towards the start of this process, I needed like 80 of one building, but now that it's down to like 10, it's just not worth bothering with. Anyway, there's the pressure conversion cubes, and I can comfortably say that we're getting there. So it's time for the final path, and that's needing to deal with all these particle accelerators. After like 20 hours, it's time to finally put all those copper ingots to use and make the copper powder. This would take 40 constructors, but with summer sloops I can drop that down to 20. That being said, I'm not made of summer sloops, and seeing as power shards are infinite and sloops are not, I'm gonna boost all these constructors so that I only need 10. I've got more than enough power, so this isn't an issue. Each one of these lanes can support exactly 2 constructors like this. I am really fond of this 2-tiered design that splits and lifts the other half directly above. I only needed 5 lanes for this, but I've got a 6th left over from the cable build, and simply because I have the space and I don't want it to look out of place, I just put all that copper into its own copper powder assembler. It won't be useful, but it'll be trying its best. I'm starting to worry that I'm overusing the pavilion design, but enclosing something like this in walls just doesn't feel appropriate. There it is, 2,000 copper powder per minute. That leaves the nuclear pasta, and to do that, I've got to build some particle accelerators. Well, not just some, a lot of particle accelerators. Once again, the design I want to use isn't really blueprintable, so I'm doing all of this raw. I actually had to make use of this game's to-do list feature and grab the insane amount of stuff you need to actually build this many particle accelerators. It's 20 in total, and I'm not even going to try to put this thing inside of a building. I don't want to talk about how many times I had to rebuild this thing either. One thing I love is this little lump of ground that you could see through. I didn't want to misalign the whole foundation just for this one little bump, and so I did this. You can barely even tell it's there. Okay, after literally like an hour of fumbling around with the belts, it is finally time to input all the stuff. That means 2 belts of copper powder and 10 of those pressure conversion cubes a minute. Getting the belts between these 2 buildings is a little awkward, but I make it work. It's kind of insane belting these cubes on such a massive belt. It's gonna take forever for this whole thing to buffer up, but I've got a few hours left in this build yet. Ever wondered what 20 particle accelerators coming online simultaneously looks like? I feel kind of bad for leaving this as mostly just a bunch of concrete, but beyond the light towers, I really couldn't think of anything that would look good. Wait a minute. There. Now it's perfect. I had to poach all the slugs from my old slug accelerators, but it was worth it. I think this officially makes this my main base now. Unfortunately, I still don't have enough to totally fill it. Maybe one day. Okay, that is officially 75% of the singularity cells completed, but the other 25% isn't nearly as involved as the nuclear pasta. Keep in mind, apart from the concrete and iron plates, literally everything else is just for that pasta. The last item is dark matter crystals, and that starts with some diamonds. They're made in even more particle accelerators, and this is why I made so much power at the beginning. The normal way to make this is with coal, but seeing as that would take 4,000 coal per minute, I've elected to use the alternative. Oil-based diamonds. Compared to the first part of this run, I'm enjoying this sort of methodical planning I'm allowed to do. I'm sure everyone's different, but compared to the first bit where it felt like I was lurching from item to item until it would tell me what to make next, the ability to step back and consider the thing as a whole is something I enjoy. That being said, building at this scale makes a few of the niggling quirks of the building system a little more prominent, so I'd say building like this and building to win both have their positives and negatives. As you can see, that oil's got to come from somewhere, and the nearest source is this northern grotto. I'm borrowing the Great Copper Highway to run the pipes, so it's not the worst experience in the world, but I've still got to do a ton of piping. And a ton of pumping to get it up here. All in all, it only takes 1,000 square meters of oil, which beats needing to find 4 pure coal nodes. If not for the big bridge already here, I probably would have made a train, but not today. The result is, now I've got 5 particle accelerators making 200 diamonds per minute. The compound looks wicked from this angle with all the accelerators going off at once, but you might see that we've still got some missing space. So to actually make the dark crystals, I've got to make some dark matter residue. I'm not making any of the items that has this as a byproduct, so the only source of it is from zapping strange alien matter. That's why I extricated it from that cave all those hours ago, and another reason I chose this spot. So I've got to come clean. I need about 1,000 SAM to make this work, and the node in there is only normal, outputting 600 per minute. The next nearest SAM site is by my aluminum build, but it's impure, which wouldn't even reach 1,000 total if I cared. So once again, I am relying on summer sloops to save me from a headache. 2 slooped and overclocked constructors will cover the reanimated SAM demand, and from there it's simply a matter of shoving them all into 6 of these converters to make the dark matter juice. I make the walls with my standard blueprint, but I edit it a bit to compensate for the height of the converters. The roof is like, I made every other roof get shallower as it goes up, so this time I made it get steeper. I'm not sure if it looks good, but sometimes that's the cost of experimentation. I like this little building. It fills out the base nicely. So with that, there is only 3 steps left before my mortal soul can finally be freed. You know what, here's a view of my old base, just in case you forgot what kind of chaos we're breaking away from with these orderly builds. I could technically skip this next step, but doing that would mean I would need 2,000 units of SAM instead, and considering how much of a pain getting 1,000 was, this is pretty much necessary. You can make dark matter crystals from diamonds, or you can put in the extra effort to turn them into time crystals first. I need about 16 of these, but I don't mind honestly. It fills out the compound a little more, and it would have been sad if the only build that uses converters was the dark matter. The actual build is really easy because it just takes in one item and spits out another item. For the style, I'm reusing my general design of putting sloped walls in the corners, but what sets it apart is this 2-tiered roof with some metal frames. I think I've really outdone myself with this one. This video could have been titled, Factorio Player Tries Actually Decorating Something. Of the 10 Satisfactory players who survived the last video, you'll need to tell me if this is any good. I've still barely seen any builds but my own in this game. But it's finally time for the penultimate step, the dark matter crystals. Compared to the other stuff, it's pretty easy. I've just got to take these time crystals and shove them into some more particle accelerators. As cool as they are, I'm getting a little tired of the particle accelerator's stubborn refusal to fit in with the overall design of this compound. It takes only 4 of these, but that's still as big as the build next door. The nice thing about dark matter residue is that it's a gas, so it doesn't need to fight gravity as I run it up this vertical shaft. These accelerator builds are always out in the open, so I give it the final pavilion treatment. It's gotta be a tall one, and for the roof I leave in some holes in it to, I don't know, vent out the particle fumes or something. But at the end of all that, there is our finished dark matter crystals. Drink it in, because with this, there is nothing stopping me from making the point of this entire base. And instead of doing that, I'm back in Powerland. Okay, this is a little embarrassing, but I looked at my power grid and thought I'd blow a fuse if everything was running at peak, and it felt like it shouldn't be possible with how much power I made. But that led me to realize that it actually made enough rocket fuel to support 200 generators, not 100. And so as I'm building another 50 thinking, yes, this is why my power grid is making half as much as I thought it should, I realized that, no, it should be making 60 gigawatts, but I never actually hooked up the wires that connect to the other 50. Math is hard, okay? Personally, I'm really happy with how well I've been able to manage the space for all these builds. The final build will slot in really nicely over here, right before the cliffs and next to the river. It might be the goal of everything, but just like all the other builds, it's simply made in 10 manufacturers. And just like all the others, I've got these offset splitters that I'll attach the lifts to in sequence. It's really not that complicated, but for a refresher it takes iron plates, concrete, nuclear pasta, and dark matter crystals. The iron and concrete come in from the front, while the dark pasta comes in from the back. You have no idea how exciting it is to finally be able to route the concrete belts I made like 30 hours ago. The whole thing eats 2,000 per minute, so by merging these 4 belts into 2 Mark 6 belts on both sides, it comes out perfect. It needs 1,000 iron plates per minute, so that can be handled with 1 Mark 6 belt. Now I've got to get the dark pasta in. I'm trying to preserve some of the natural beauty of this river, so I'm mostly building metal foundations. But I've run the dark matter crystals all the way around to the particle accelerators. It is actually insane seeing this much nuclear pasta in one place after making that first base. 10 per minute might not sound like much, but I assure you, it is a lot. While all those belts slowly buffer up, I'll make the final building. The walls are just going to be the larger wall blueprint, with some custom designs on the front and the back to fully enclose it. In spite of what's inside, it's not that special of a building. But after hooking up all the lights and running the belts out front, I can finally turn this thing on. This is what it's all about, and this view from inside is something else. It turns out it takes a while to buffer in 200 concrete. As this churns away, I'd like you to think on all the things we did to get this far. You watching me, while I spent 60 hours doing this all by myself. You know, it's the assumed moral support of the viewers that really gets me through it all. And with that, there's our first batch of singularity cells. So that's 100 singularity cells per minute, but we can do better. I've still got a bunch of sloops left over in the old base, and seeing as I really don't need more power, I can deconstruct the power augmenter for another 10 sloops. I could have made only 4 manufacturers to save on the sloops, but as it stands, I'll need 40 sloops to fill everything, which is all the ones I've got left, but it just felt wrong to miss out on the full size of the final building. And there's 200 singularity cells per minute. We're not quite done yet, because we still got to sink this stuff, but building just a sink feels so anticlimactic. That's why instead I'm building this pillar. I figure I ought to actually use the curved foundations for once. Maybe you can see the vision. First, our singularity cells must climb the mighty spiral to prove they're worthy to be synced. It took like 10 minutes to do this, but tell me it wasn't worth it. It's literally perfect. It fills in the one missing spot in my compound impeccably. And now I must confess, the entire time I've been building this, I've been secretly collecting ballistics warp drives in my old base. I really wanted to see who would win, me building a whole different compound, or me if I just spent that same amount of time AFKing. I've got like 4,000 of these altogether, which should be quite a few points. So I hook up both of the containers packed to the brim with warp drives, and yeah, that's a lot of tickets. In fact, that is so many tickets, it actually manages to max out the 32-bit integer used to display the points per minute. Considering we're sinking 1,200 per minute, the real number is 3,474,400,800. Even with the fastest belt in the game, it takes over 3 minutes to completely sink all of these, and I'm left with 866 tickets. You know, part of me is happy that it didn't get the full 1,000, but let's not think about how it probably would have been enough if I'd just been making all the other assembly items as well. The fact remains, I've got a couple more tickets to farm. I actually moved my hub in here just to make it nice and official that this is my main base now. I also placed down my crappy bronze statue, which is soon to be superseded. And all that's left to do is watch it go. I'm still surprised that that last video got as many views as it did. I mean, it's not like I'm any good at Satisfactory, at least not compared to Factorio, but I suppose it's got perspective. It's kind of funny, since I hardly even registered Satisfactory's existence until making that video on it. I kind of unwittingly engaged in some generational trauma from the Satisfactory players. Apparently Factorio players have a bit of a reputation for being condescending, and I think the video where I constantly compared the two set some of those people off. When I talk about games that aren't Factorio, I've usually got to remind people that I just sound like this, and that I actually generally like video games, but I guess Satisfactory being so similar to Factorio made me forget that part. I guess some people thought I was like forcing myself to play it for the content or something. For the record, if I don't want to play something, I don't make a video on it. Sharing my builds in these games as well as my thoughts on some indie titles is my hobby. In fact, I care so little about maximizing my success that I turned down a $12,000 offer to shill one of the usual suspects in this video. Does that make me stupid? Maybe, but it definitely doesn't make me a sellout. By the way, if you want to take it upon yourself to make up for that crippling loss, my Patreon's over there. Anyway, while that's working, I also go around looking for some Mercer spheres and hard drives because I wanted to 100% the game. I haven't even 100%ed Factorio since the 2.0 expansion. Now, no one can say I didn't play enough. I did say I regretted not getting the golden nut in the last video, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that this video wasn't in part inspired by all the Satisfactory superfans saying that I didn't beat the game because I didn't play it correctly. So I built more for aesthetics this time, and I had a good time doing it, just like the last video, but you know what? My opinions haven't changed at all. Satisfactory is a great little game, and it really comes down to what you value. If you prefer raw logistical challenges, you'll go for Factorio, but if you primarily enjoy the sort of basement model railroad set style of Satisfactory, then you'll go for that. The reason Factorians have a reputation for being smug is because their game is legitimately more complex. I mean, look at this. You can't build whatever this thing is in Satisfactory, but there's plenty of people who don't really care that you can't do this, and that's fine. Just recognize that we Factorio players have what we enjoy, and so do you. Alright, enough of that rambling. At the end of it all, with an average of 23 million points per minute, there's 1,000 tickets. And there you have it, the completely worthless, arbitrary trophy. Just look at the size of my nut. That's how hard it is to get the golden nut in Satisfactory. All in all, I like how my compound came out, and I'm glad I'm leaving it on this instead of that other video. I considered letting this base run until I could afford all the statues, but then a lightning bolt came from the sky and took out my power, so I took that as a sign from God to stop playing Satisfactory forever. I hope all you Satisfactory players who subscribed enjoyed this video, because I'm never going to play it again. Respectfully though. Okay, bye.